Welcome to Will's Personal Development Show. Today I have a very special guest that I am very excited to bring on. His name is Matthew Polly, and he wrote the new biography on Bruce Lee. Now I'm a huge fan of just Bruce Lee, and I think this book just blew me away. I went into it with expectations or assumptions about Bruce Lee, and this book is just so detailed and really paints the true picture and details of Bruce's life. I thought he was so gracious to come on as a guest, but more importantly, I think it's spectacular that um, we come to discuss this, especially now when Crazy Rich Asians has just been released, and there's all this talk about Asian representation. So Matthew, I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you, Will, for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Awesome. So I just want to get started off the bat. How did you get so detailed with this book? I know you did a lot of research. You probably interviewed a lot of people. How did that even come about, and was it was it tough?
Yeah, so I the first thing I did is I tried to read everything that had ever been written about Bruce, and to watch everything that Bruce had ever been in, and that took about 2 years because he there's a lot of books about Bruce Lee,
Wow.
uh, not many good books about Bruce Lee, but a lot of them. And then I spent 6 months in Hong Kong interviewing people who knew him when he was a child and later in life who were colleagues of his, and about 6 months in LA and Seattle, where he lived in America. So I did over 100 interviews. And basically, I felt that previous Bruce Lee books had covered certain aspects of his life very well, but they had never covered the whole human being, from birth to death. They tended to focus more on his time in America. And I really wanted to get a sense of who Bruce Lee was throughout his entire life in a really holistic way.
Yeah, that was incredible. I was listening to another interview of you, and you said how Steve McQueen had so many biographies, but no one had really honored Bruce and written a thorough biography about that. So I thank you for that. Um, how hard was it to actually get these interviews? Were the everyone you reached out to willing to talk to you, or was this something where you had to kind of pull teeth to get an interview?
It depended. Some people were very excited. For example, I was one of the first people to ever interview his childhood classmates from LaSalle, and no one had ever thought to talk to them about who Bruce Lee was. And when they remember Bruce Lee, he was kind of a punkish kid who got into a lot of trouble and stirred up fights. And so they had a very different image of him than what has, been part of the legend since he died. So they were happy to tell the story. And then there were some people, for example, Chuck Norris, didn't want to do an interview with me, mostly because he's just tired of talking about Bruce Lee. Everywhere he goes, he gets asked about Bruce. So it ran the whole gamut. Some people were easier than others. But what I tried to do is talk to everybody so that people didn't want to be left out. So I would, when I, for example, was going to talk to Taki Kimura, I said, well, I've already talked to Linda Lee, Shannon Lee, Dan Inosanto, Robert Lee, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, well, if you talk to all of them, then I want to talk to you too. So that was my approach, was to simply, like Bruce did in fighting, I wanted to overwhelm my opponents.
Yeah, that's awesome. I also marveled at the amount of detail you had with the history of certain events as you painted them. You didn't just base it off interviews. It seems like you did a lot of research into the history of certain events. I remember one that speaks out is just all the events around how Chinese immigrants settled into the U.S. in the 1900s and so forth, and the racism and ostracization and all the stuff that occurred during that time. Um, and that was enlightening for me as an Asian American millennial because I really didn't know any of this. I just kind of came into this world with assumptions. Could you talk about, doing the research for that too?
Yeah, I thought it was really important not just to write about Bruce Lee himself, but to set it in a historical context. I think previous books about Bruce treat him almost like a demigod. as if he sort of descended from heaven and just started kicking butt. But he was a human being like the rest of us, and he grew up in a particular time and place, and he faced certain historical problems and discriminations. And I really wanted to tell his story as sort of emblematic of the plight, the struggle, and the success of Chinese in America, starting with the 1850s when the coolie trade was going on and the first Chinese came to America as mine workers. And then how after the gold ran dry, they built the Pacific Railroad. And then initially they were welcomed as cheap labor, and then they were viewed as a threat in the same way sort of Mexican Americans are now by other laborers. And then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was the first time any group had been excluded specifically because of their nation of origin, and the programs against them, where there was the driving out. Even that history I didn't know until I started the research. And so I thought it was important to give a sense of what it was like and the level of discrimination Bruce faced when he was trying to make it in Hollywood.
That's awesome. So you touch on a few points that I want to dive into. I think there's two big things that I really got out of the book, if anything else. So the first would be that, I went in with these assumptions, like you said, that, Bruce Lee was very different from me. He was someone who had no fears. He was, super confident and was just a winner from the moment he was born. And obviously that was shattered completely. He was clearly a human with fears and insecurities and flaws. And then the second big thing I learned from this was just how much of an impact he made and what he needed to do to succeed and make that impact. So I want to touch on the first one. I know it's probably difficult to paint a story of someone who is not perfect when you have to interview these guests. You probably at some point in the book realized that you can't, you have to paint a realistic picture of Bruce. So how did you go about doing that without, offending any of the people you interviewed who only want, Bruce to be shown in a positive light?
Yeah, that's one of the it's one of the difficult things in writing a biography is that my feeling is you owe your loyalty to the audience, to the readers. They're paying you the money, and your job is to give them the most honest story possible. But certainly some of the people I interviewed were worried that I might talk about some aspects of Bruce's life that they wanted to keep secret or wanted not to have anyone pay attention to. And so I realized at a certain point that I just couldn't make everybody happy. And so I was going to have to write what I considered the most honest portrayal possible. But I think you touched on one really interesting thing about Bruce being human. One of the aspects of the story that when I was talking to Phoebe, his sister, and also reading some of the things that Robert, his little brother, said that gave me a clue to what he had to struggle with. His older brother, Peter, was the favored one. And I think I think all families have this, but particularly amongst Asian families that I know, Peter was the studious, the scholarly, the introverted, the hardworking one. And Bruce was the screw up. He was the one who got into trouble in school. He was hyperactive. And his father was always punishing him because he couldn't act like his brother, Peter. And when I understood that sort of dynamic, then it gave me a real sense of who Bruce Lee was as a human being. He was somebody who was always sort of mad that his father favored his older brother, but always wanted his father's approval as well. And I thought that sort of captured an interesting psychological dynamic of who Bruce Lee was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you actually did do it this way. That was one of the main draws that I loved about this book. I wanted the truth. I didn't just want, the good sides. And it really helped me relate to him and probably a lot of other people who read this book too. I found myself, as many, young listeners to this podcast will probably do, I found myself relating to where he was at certain ages to where I was at that age. And Nowadays we kind of beat ourselves up and say, oh, we're not successful at 20, or we're not as successful as we want to be at 25. And Bruce was still,